Hi, Todd VanDenburg here with VanDenburg Capital Management and another Uncommon Sense update. So boy, that was a fun day yesterday, wasn't it? The Dow was down roughly 1,100 points. Russell 2000 was down 4.4-ish. The NASDAQ was down big. The S&P 500 was down. I mean, it was just horrible. And so the big question I've been getting for the last 24 hours is, oh my gosh, Todd, why? Um, and it really started. I mean, the markets were actually up right until the moment that Fed Chair Powell came out and he announced, that they're going to reduce the Fed funds rate by another quarter of a percent. So that's good. We all like lower interest rates. But at the same time, he basically changed his guidance for 2025. There was an expectation prior to yesterday that there might be up to 4 rate cuts in 2025. And after Chairman Powell spoke, that number went down to basically 2, so that there might be 2 rate cuts in 2025. And the biggest thing that he talked about as far as why that might be really had to do with his concerns about how inflation really isn't as under control as they would like. It's not trending to the 2% target that they had set for themselves, and just generally things not looking as good as they would like. But then that begs the question of, if inflation's not where they want and it's not heading in the direction that they want, why would they actually cut rates in the first place? I mean, the Fed's actions, and people who watch my videos know I've not been very complimentary of the Fed for, gosh, 15 years. Back when Janet Yellen was chair of the Fed, I mean, they have messed this up so badly, to the point, and changed things to the point where I honestly don't think that they really know where things are going and whether or not their actions are contributing to the problem or contributing to a solution. I'll just give you an example from Chairman Powell's comments yesterday. Is one of the reasons that they're concerned about inflation is, the new incoming Trump administration has talked about how they're going to use tariffs to try to get trade under control, and to try to get economic activity increasing in the United States, and not allow foreign entities to sell stuff in the United States unfairly low priced. And in and of itself, if all the Trump administration was going to do is put tariffs on everybody, Mexico, Canada, China, you name it, right? If all they were going to do is just put tariffs on everybody, and all of a sudden we were going to become an isolationist country, that absolutely would increase the cost of everything, no doubt. And when Chair Powell talks about this stuff, I mean, okay, yes, that's a real concern. I don't think it's all that realistic, but hey, in isolation, that is a real potential risk in the next coming couple of years. What's a little frustrating about what Chairman Powell didn't say is that, if you're going to talk about the Trump administration plans, you should also talk about the Trump administration's plans to basically do away with tons of federal regulations that arguably shouldn't be there in the first place. Now, federal regulations. These are things where the federal government. Well, here, I'll just use one quick example of how bureaucracy and regulations can actually cause things to be more expensive. So, as many of you know, several years ago, after the fires here in Sonoma County, my wife and I decided that we didn't want fires anymore, so we packed up and we moved to Texas. And we went to go build a house, because we're like, okay, well, we're here in Texas. Let's build a house that we want to live in. And so we met with a builder, and the first question I asked after we decided, what the house was going to look like is, okay, what's it going to cost, and how long is it going to take to get permits? And the builder looked at me and he smiled and he's like, permits? Well, what permits? It's your land. Build what you want. I was floored because, again, when we consider what it would have cost in Sonoma County, or what it did cost in Sonoma County for all the people who were building homes because they had been burned down in the fires, it was months and months and months and thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in fees. I mean, the bureaucracy was really a big part of the problem in getting things rebuilt. Now, that's not to say that there's no building codes in the state of Texas. There absolutely are. It's just, in Texas, they go about it in a different way in a lot of jurisdictions where they don't require that you ask permission to build on land that you own, depending on where you're doing it and what you're building. So taking me back to the Trump administration, talking about reducing the burden of the federal bureaucracy, well, if they're actually able to do that, that would actually lower the cost of doing business. And so that would not be inflationary. So why Fed Chair Powell didn't, when he was being critical of the tariff regime that the Trump administration is going to do, why he wouldn't balance that with some information about, but if at the same time as implementing tariffs, they're able to reduce the impact of regulation and bureaucracy on the economy, that could be a net positive. Well, he didn't say any of that. And so as a result, all the markets got was this negative message of potentially inflation is going to be a problem in 2025. And so the markets just went berserk. And then once the institutional traders saw that the markets were starting to go berserk, they just dogpiled on the rabbit, and then the Dow ends up down 1,100 points. But so to sort of tie into this, how can the incoming Trump administration actually reduce regulation and bureaucracy? Now, there's lots of hyperbole in the media about entire departments that they're going to try to get rid of, and I'm not going to talk about any of that because that actually would require Congress. But there's an entire section of the government and how the government is run that can be changed overnight just through executive action. And so I'm going to take a minute and explain to you what I think is coming in the next couple of years. So first off, every time a federal agency wants to implement a new regulation, they have to publish it in what's called the Federal Register. Feel free to Google Federal Register, and if you want to read it, I think at last count there's like 85 volumes of it, millions of pages in the Federal Register. And every year we keep adding new pages, new regulations to the Federal Register. So like back in the 1950s, they might add 8,000, 10,000 pages to the Federal Register. These days, we're adding 80 to 100,000 new pages per year of new regulations to the Federal Register. Now, the way the Trump administration, in my opinion, is going to do something about all these federal regulations that continue to get put on us is we have to go back to earlier this year, 2024, when the Supreme Court invalidated a prior ruling called the Chevron doctrine. And I'm getting in the weeds here, but that's where I love to be. So the Chevron doctrine, that was basically a ruling by the courts that said if legislation passed by Congress was vague, the bureaucracy could then create implementation language and basically make up things that may have not been in the actual law that was passed by Congress. The regulatory agency and bureaucracy, they could basically write their own rules, effectively creating things that maybe Congress had never anticipated. And prior to earlier this year, the courts had a ruling that said, hey, where there's ambiguity you defer to the knowledge of the bureaucracy, and what the bureaucracy thinks is right, that's what gets greater weight. Well, earlier this year, the Supreme Court came back and changed that, gutted it, and said, it doesn't make sense to defer to the bureaucracy. What we should have been doing is kicking it back to Congress and saying, hey, your law was not specific enough, and so you need to pass a new law. You need to update the rules. Don't just leave it to unelected people to make up their own stuff. I'm going to give you one quick example. Let's see, the EPA, through some of these regulations that they publish within the Federal Register, had basically extended in the past decade or so their regulatory oversight ability over what are called bodies of water in the United States. And because Congress didn't clearly define what a body of water was, the EPA had gotten to the point where they were trying to regulate farmers. If it rained too much in their fields and there was standing water in the middle of their crops, the EPA would consider that a body of water that then could be regulated by the government. I mean, it had gone completely out of control. And so with the repeal of the Chevron doctrine, now we can't and won't be allowed to defer to the regulatory agency. And what that means is that now the incoming Trump administration is going to be able to start going through the Federal Register, looking at every regulation that has been implemented in the past 40 years, maybe longer. And if you cannot tie that regulation back directly to a piece of legislation, arguably just simply through executive order, they're going to be able to wipe out that regulation because it does not comply with the Supreme Court's ruling. So a lot of stuff is going to be done. And so when Chairman Powell talks about just tariffs and how that could have a negative impact on the economy and inflation, I think it's just as important that he find a way to talk about the other things that the Trump administration might be doing that maybe won't have a negative impact on inflation. Every administration, whether it's Republican or Democratic, does some things that are good and some things that are bad. And so these people like the Federal Reserve, I just think it's incumbent on them to actually give a more balanced view so that investors like you and me can make sound choices about where things might be going. So long story short, I know I talked a little longer than I normally do about this kind of stuff, but it really annoyed me yesterday, in addition to the fact that the Dow was down 1,100 points. It really annoyed me how really the incomplete truth that was told by Chairman Powell led to the market going down so much. I mean, it was completely unnecessary if they'd have just given a more balanced explanation of the things that the incoming administration might be doing. Again, not everything that the incoming administration is going to do is going to be good or right. They're going to do tons of stuff that I think that we're all going to look back in 20 years and scratch our heads at. But that doesn't change the fact that when it's something like the Federal Reserve and the amount of influence they can have on things like the markets, I just think they should be more careful with their words. And so as I'm looking at investing through 2025 and even beyond that, I'm certainly not pessimistic simply because of tariffs or anything else. It's, what we really need to see is when the incoming administration actually gets sworn in January and the Republicans are in control of the House and the Senate, we now need to actually see what they can accomplish. What are they going to try to do? And then we can start making some decisions about, all right, so is the markets the right place? Is U.S. equities the right place? Are there other places that we should be investing? Are there things we should avoid? But you shouldn't be making these decisions so far in advance of anything actually happening, because then you're just contributing to volatility, and we're certainly not making any moves. I mean, as hard as yesterday was to take, selling into yesterday's market, I think would just be, a big mistake. We really need to see if the Trump administration goes through the Federal Register and starts taking out regulations. Imagine, right? Every one of those regulations costs we, the people, cost us money to comply with. And if we can reduce the number of regulations that we have to comply with, that should save money in the economy and should keep the cost of goods and services from growing beyond our ability to cover them with wage increases. So be patient, take a deep breath. Things like yesterday happen. If you had gone to sleep a month ago and woken up at the close of the market yesterday and just said, hey, so how things go, basically it was flat. So yesterday's loss in the market basically put the markets back to where they were a month ago. And I don't know anybody a month ago, if I'd have said, okay, are you good with where we are? Like, would you be happy if we ended the year where we are? Most people would have said yes, considering when we started the year, nobody thought we'd be that the Dow specifically would be anywhere near 40,000, much less closer to 44,000. So take a deep breath, be patient. Don't try to speculate on things that might happen, places the market might go, what might people do. Take a moment and wait to observe the things that actually start to happen. And then make decisions based upon good, solid information. So if anybody has any questions about this, any questions about the Fed, any questions about this Federal Reserve and the Chevron doctrine, please call me, email me, text me. I'm happy to respond to any questions. This kind of stuff, I find it just fascinating, annoying at times, but fascinating. So that was your update. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give us a like, give us a share, and I'll be back again soon with another Uncommon Sense update. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to be the first to hear of more Uncommon Sense updates like these, please click the subscribe button below. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks again.